Hello, my name is Whitney and I work in the Adult Services Department at Columbus Public Library. I've been a hobby watercolorist for about 5 years now, and I'd like to share what I've learned so far. In this video, I'm going to be sharing basics about materials to help you get started, save money, and make your supplies last longer. But first, I do always like to start out with any of my classes and say that I'm not an expert and I've never been trained, nor have I attended any classes. I've found out most of this through trial and error and a lot of error, and through some YouTube videos. So if you've heard something different from a professional, I would follow that. Alright, let's get started. One of the first things you'll need, obviously, is brushes. You'll want brushes that hold water and let go of the pigment easily. If you've painted before, in a bind you can use whatever brush you have, but in the long run, if you want to watercolor, you should really invest in some actual watercolor brushes. Honestly, watercolor brushes just give you more control over what you're painting. It saves dunking the brush over and over to get more water, and ultimately they make your pigments last longer. You can get a decent set of watercolor brushes for around $5. I typically paint out in the wild, like at coffee shops or out in nature, and I like to use these brushes. Mostly because they hold their own water in these little reservoirs. You can control the water flow by squeezing. Just bring some extra water in some little squeeze droppers and you can fill them up in case they run out. If you want to try these, I suggest buying them online because they are vastly cheaper. And I'm talking like $10 to $15 cheaper online than they are in local craft stores. The next supply is paper towels. Obviously, you can use them to dry your brushes and to soak up mistakes, but you can also use them to create interesting textures. When I buy a roll of paper towels for watercoloring, I purposely look for them with pretty quilted designs in them because when you leave them on a painting that's very wet, it can leave the design from the paper on it. You'll also need 2 cups of water, one for cleaning your brushes and one for water without pigment or color in it. It's important to keep them separate so that you get the most vibrant colors as possible. It also saves you from having to get clean water over and over and over again. The next supply is watercolor paper. You should use paper specifically designed for watercolor because regular water will rip and warp regular paper. Watercolor paper is made so that it absorbs the water and pigment you put on it, and it is much thicker than regular paper. When you first start, I suggest buying the pads of paper that are the most affordable. While I always suggest keeping the first thing you make, it doesn't have to look great, so the most affordable is perfect. Here's a money-saving tip: never throw away watercolor paper. You can always use the mistakes as scrap paper to test out what colors will look like before you put them on another painting that you actually want to keep. You can also cut up a piece of watercolor paper you don't want to keep as a finished piece of art for bookmarks. There are also watercolor sketchbooks that allow you to easily keep track of your progress. There are so many different watercolor sets to choose from. However, in my opinion, this is the one thing that you shouldn't feel bad about spending money on. Go for a medium quality set and use a coupon from one of the major retailers to get 40 or 50% off. When used correctly, they last a long time, and if you bought the most affordable watercolor set, you wouldn't enjoy painting with it at all, and your results wouldn't be that great. Generally, watercolor sets come in cakes, pans, or tubes. There are others. Artists like to get a little crazy and mix some science with their pigments, so you can find things like jelly paints. But the cakes, pan, and tubes are the most common. Cakes are very dry and powdery, and usually they're the most affordable. Pans have a binding agent in them, and depending on the brand, can be a little sticky or shiny to the touch. Pans are what I recommend to starting with because in my experience they usually give better results and they're easy to transport. Tubes are sometimes harder for beginners to use because they're usually very concentrated and a lot of the paints get wasted when you try to figure out how to mix and get lighter and darker versions of the color you want. I don't suggest starting with tubes, but if someone gifted you some of these, you definitely should use them. When choosing your first palette, you can get some great guidance from artists on YouTube by searching for beginner watercolor set. Usually the price difference between the most affordable and the mid-range is $7 to $10, but I promise this is the one place where you want to spend a little bit more to get quality paint. If your set doesn't come with a palette, then you should get one. This is one of my go-to sets and palettes. Palettes allow you to mix colors and mix a lighter or darker version of a color. It helps save so much pigment. You should be pulling pigment off your set and mixing it on a palette. At the end of your paint session, let your palette dry out, and next time just add water to activate the same color you mixed on your palette. Since we're using watercolor, I highly suggest using a palette with wells. I move a lot when I paint, so no one wants to try to balance water on a flat palette. The next thing we'll talk about is painters and masking tape. You'll use this to tape your paper down so it doesn't buckle when you add water to it. Make sure you test this out on the paper you have before you use it on something that you want to keep in the long term, particularly if you're buying affordable watercolor paper. Sometimes the tape can tear the edges of your paper. This could be for a couple different reasons. The first is that your tape has too strong of an adhesive, which is why I suggest sticking to masking or painter's tape. Secondly, you should let your paper completely dry before taking the tape off. To be safe, usually I wait 24 hours before taking the tape off of a finished piece. And then take the tape off very slowly. Masking fluid. It isn't really necessary, but if you find some at a good price, it is fun to play around with, and you can get some really nice effects. You'll use masking fluid when you don't want to get the paint on a certain part of the paper. Typically, this is used to preserve white space, but if you've already painted something, I have seen artists let that part completely dry and then mask over it to protect that certain color they don't want to get mixed. The rest of this video will go over common items you'll find at home or you have already that you can use to add some interesting effects to your watercolor or make your painting life just a little easier. The first is salt. Salt will soak up the water and pigment around it and cause some lighter dark circles wherever the granules fall. I've used this to create something like snow, rain, and some interesting patterns on clothes. Plastic, like plastic bags, this is my favorite effect and I use it a lot. If you're a plastic bag collector, and let's face it, we all are, you can use those bags that have holes in them before you recycle them. You can cut them up to the size that you want and crumple them up. I use this a lot for backgrounds because it just adds some interest to the painting without being too distracting. The longer you leave the plastic there, the more detailed and pronounced the lines it creates will be. Bubble wrap works just like plastic. Instead of random lines, it's more of a uniformed polka dot look. You can use a hairdryer. This is one of my absolute favorite shortcuts. Instead of sitting around waiting for your paint to dry, you can use a hairdryer to speed up the process. Hold the hairdryer far away from your paper or it can warp or even burn your paper. Also, make sure you aren't putting a lot of heat on any tape or masking fluid on your paper because it can cause it to stick and rip your paper. Pencils and pens. You don't need anything special to sketch with, but keep in mind you will see the sketch behind your watercolor. You can draw lightly, or after you're done watercoloring the piece, you can line your piece with a pen and cover up the pencil. If you use a pen, always test the pen first. Some pens won't work well after something's been watercolored. While I won't cover it in this video, you can find pens that allow you to paint over them with watercolor. But again, always test it before you do it on a piece you want to keep. I like the affordable Bic pens. They also come in a variety of colors. I found that the cheaper the pens are, the more water resistant they are, weirdly enough. I also like to use white gel pens on top of finished pieces as a highlighter. Since we aren't professionals here, one trick is if you have a small amount leaking, you can also cover it up with a white pen if you used white watercolor paper. You can also use color pencils on top of watercolor. My last tip is to challenge yourself to use everything you paint. Save them for scraps or layer pen, pencil, color pencil, or even other paint on top of mistakes. You can cut out parts you don't like and use them as bookmarks, to decorate a wrapped gift as a name tag, or even make a thoughtful card for a loved one. If you paint something after watching this video, post it on Facebook and tag us in the comments. Thanks for watching.